Please welcome to the stage Jenny Odell.
Hey, so thanks for being here, and my talk is called How to Do Nothing. And as silly as that sounds, I really sincerely hope that it is helpful for all of you. So I want to start off by saying that this talk is grounded in a particular location, and that is the Morecambe Rose Garden in Oakland. Any Oakland people here? Yeah, okay. And that's because I largely wrote this talk in the garden. But I also realized as I was writing it that the garden encompasses everything that's in this talk, which is the practice of doing nothing, but also the architecture of nothing, the importance of public space, and an ethics of care and maintenance, and also birds. So what was I doing in the Rose Garden in the first place? I live really close by, so it was kind of my default place to get away from my computer, which is where I do a lot of my work as an artist and as a teacher. But after the election, I started going to the Rose Garden almost every day. And this wasn't really a conscious decision. It was kind of instinctual. It reminded me of like a deer going to a salt lick or a goat going to the top of a hill. And it was just innate. And what I would do there is just nothing. I wouldn't even read a book. I would just sit there. And as incongruous as this kind of seemed, like a beautiful garden versus terrifying world, it did feel like a very necessary thing to be doing and kind of like a survival tactic. So I found a really great description of this necessity of doing nothing that was written in 1985, but I think we can all identify with this to a degree that's maybe even painful. And so this is from Deleuze, but basically the function of doing nothing is that it's a precursor to something, and that doing nothing is necessary for meaningful thought and speech. So it's not a luxury or a waste of time, it's actually completely necessary. So I want to backtrack here and just say that I have long had a relationship with doing nothing, but as an artist, or more properly, making nothing. So I'm not lazy, but the most I can ever have been said to do was provide a new context for or perspective on something that already existed. So in my series, Satellite Landscapes, I painstakingly removed the ground from photo-merged screenshots of infrastructural sites on Google Earth, pretty much solely so that people would consider them more carefully or at all. And in my project, The Bureau of Suspended Objects, which I did as an artist in residence at the dump, I spent 3 months photographing, cataloging, and researching the origins of 200 discarded objects. And this has produced a book, as well as a browsable archive in which people could scan tags next to the objects and learn about their manufacturing, material, and corporate histories. And one woman at the opening at Recology was confused and asked me, so do you actually make anything, or do you just put things on shelves? And I'm really, really grateful to her because I think that's like the best description of my practice I've ever heard, is putting things on shelves. So after that, I was an artist in residence at the Internet Archive. I spent another couple months going through old Byte magazines. And for anyone who's unfamiliar with Byte magazine, it's like an 80s hobbyist computing magazine. It's amazing. All of the covers were made by like the same guy, and they all look like this. So I spent some time collecting what I called specimens from these magazines. So basically images from ads, and then I'm just taking out all the text and dropping the background back in. And I was trying to find objects or arrangements of objects that I find intentionally or unintentionally surrealist. And I want to stress that I'm not doing anything to these images except for removing the text and cropping them. And like that's a guy with like DOS and Unix inside a tie. I did not put him in there. He was already there. And even in the cases where it required sort of more like time and effort on my part, it was really something more akin to like historical restoration. And so these are interesting to me because they sort of inadvertently predict some of the more sinister aspects that technology came to embody. But more importantly, I just really love them. And I think that's kind of the most important part here, is just like the love of going through these images. And it really brought home to me that I like finding better than making, so much that I sometimes can't be bothered to make anything. And so this love of finding is something that I kind of provisionally call the observational eros. It's just a phrase that I made up, which is an emotional fascination with one subject that's so strong that it overpowers the desire to make anything new. And this just reminded me of the introduction to Cannery Row, which I remember coming across in high school. And he's describing the patience and care involved in the close study of one specimen. So if you, like the carefulness and sort of if you press too hard, these things will break. So that kind of like relationship to one's subjects is something that I feel as an artist. So it probably is not surprising to you that my favorite movies are documentaries, and that my favorite public art was actually made by a documentary filmmaker, Eleanor Coppola. So in 1973, she carried out this public art project called Windows, and it's just a map. And there was basically a specific day where you were invited to go to these locations in the city and just sit and observe the window, and that was the art. And so it's like recognition of art where it is found. And I think that it's important to contrast that with how public art normally is, which is like a giant steel thing that landed from outer space in a corporate plaza. This is kind of a much lighter touch that, again, recognizes art where it already is, or proposes art where it already is. And then in a similar vein, this is a piece by a friend of mine, Scott, Scott Pollock. It's called Applause Encouraged, and as you can probably guess, this was a piece for 8 people. They were ushered in by a greeter. They were reminded not to take photos. When the sunset finished, they applauded and refreshments were served. So that kind of brings me to the sort of architecture of nothing. So in some of these examples, or in the Coppola piece and Scott's piece, the artist creates a space or even a cordoned off area that holds open a contemplative mindset or space against all of the pressures that are threatening to close it down. So this is something that I think about really often when I'm at the Rose Garden. Anyone who's been there knows that it's not your typical sort of square garden with rows. It has many stairways and kind of branching pathways. It goes through the roses, but it also goes through the wilder aspects of the garden, like redwoods and oak trees. And there are probably 100 possible ways to move through the garden and 100 more places to sit. And then not far from there, I often sort of continue on my walk to the Chapel of the Chimes, which is the columbarium. It's basically like a library of ashes. And there are, again, hundreds of tiny rooms, probably with little containers of ashes that are annotated with like photographs and notes. And it really invites you to kind of consider someone else's life from beginning to end, and then by extension, your own life from beginning to end. And I've been there many times, and I still sometimes get kind of lost. And then just on that note, kind of labyrinths in general are something that I'm really interested in. So usually contemporary labyrinths are sort of meant for contemplative walking at this point. But I think that they're really interesting as designs that manipulate your sense of time and space. They function kind of similarly to the way that they look. So they kind of create this dense infolding of attention in one location. Just through basically a two-dimensional design, they make it possible not to walk straight through a space or stand in one spot, but do something kind of in between. And those are kind of spatial visual examples, but I also want to give an example involving sound. So I always come back to Pauline Oliveros' idea of deep listening. She is was a composer who was classically trained in composition and also did a lot of really interesting work with electronic music. But in the 70s, she was kind of trying to find a way of working with sound that could bring some inner peace amidst the violence and unrest of the Vietnam War. And so this is her description of deep listening, which is listening in every possible way to everything possible to hear no matter what you are doing. And it's kind of listening outward and inward at the same time. She also distinguished between listening and mere hearing. So hearing is kind of things coming into your ear, and listening is attending to what you're hearing. And for her, the goal and the reward of doing that was just a general heightened sense of receptivity, which was kind of the reversal of the norm for her culturally. She noted that we usually privilege like judgment and reaction over kind of receptivity and intuition. So as I read that, and I realized that I'd already had an introduction to deep listening through the practice of bird watching, but I don't think that they should call it bird watching, because anyone who does that knows that half, if not more, of bird watching is bird listening. So I'm going to propose that they call it bird noticing. And the thing that bird noticing has in common with deep listening is that it requires you to quite literally do nothing. It's sort of the opposite of looking something up online. Like, you can't look for birds. You just have to walk around and wait for them to come out. And when you do hear or see one, you kind of have to just stop. And when this happens for me, like, time seems to stop, and I'm very often late to things. That's not a joke. It's like a problem. I'm like late to things because I see interesting birds. I was literally late to my own class that I teach because I saw a blue heron at Stanford, and I was like, I can't move. Okay, so what really amazed me about doing this was that it kind of changed the granularity of my perception, which I was starting to realize was pretty low res. So at first, I kind of just noticed the presence of birdsong in general more, and that it's everywhere all the time, every day. But in particular, I couldn't understand how I went most of my adult life without noticing the sounds of scrub jays, which are very loud and sound like this. Maybe it sounds familiar to some of you. And so after that, I kind of started to recognize other songs one by one, so that now when I walk into the rose garden, I sort of acknowledge them as if they were people, like hi, raven, robin, song sparrow, chickadee, goldfinch, hawk, wren, nuthatch, woodpecker, and so on. And this diversification of what was previously bird sounds into discrete sounds that carry meaning is something that I can only compare to realizing that my mom speaks 3 languages and not 2. So my mom has only ever spoken English to me. I assumed that she was speaking Tagalog with other Filipino people, and I don't really have a good reason for that, except that I knew she did speak Tagalog, and it all sounded like Tagalog to me. It turns out that she was only sometimes speaking Tagalog and other times speaking Ilonggo, which is a completely different language that is specific to where she's from in the Philippines. These languages are not the same. One is not a dialect of the other. And it turns out that the Philippines is full of languages that are so different that speakers would not be able to understand each other, according to my mom, and Tagalog is only one. And so this kind of embarrassing discovery that something that you thought was one thing is actually 2 things, and those 2 things are actually 10 things, seems kind of naturally cumulative, but also just like a simple function of the quality and duration of your attention. So something that those kind of moments of stopping and the labyrinthine spaces that I was describing earlier have in common is that they all enact some kind of pause or removal. So the rose garden, for instance, is kind of it was specifically put there because of this bowl shape in the hill. So you kind of feel like you're acoustically and spatially like in the rose garden. Similarly with the Chapel of the Chimes, there are some skylights, but there are very few windows to the outside, and half of it's underground. So you kind of, again, feel like you're going into it and you're there and then coming out. Labyrinths, by their very shape, kind of collect your attention into a very small circular space. Rebecca Solnit, writing about the labyrinth at the Grace Cathedral, notes that she was so absorbed that she lost sight of the people nearby and hardly heard the sound of traffic and the bells for 6 o'clock. And that's not a new idea. It also applies, I think, over longer periods of time. So I think we all have or know someone who has gone through a period of some type of removal during which they changed their perspective pretty significantly on something, on whatever they came back to. And sometimes that's voluntary, and other times it's occasioned by something really terrible, like illness or loss. So it turns out that one of our most famous observers, John Muir, had just such an experience. So before he was the botanist that we all know him as, he was a supervisor and sometimes inventor at a wagon wheel factory. So these are some of his inventions. And one of his scarier inventions was a study desk that would open the book you were supposed to be reading for an allotted period of time and then close it and then open the next book, which seems somehow very like Silicon Valley to me, but whatever. Up until this point, though, botany was like a side thing for him. But when he was 29, he had an eye accident at that factory that temporarily blinded him and confined him to a darkened room for 6 weeks, during which he was unsure if he was ever going to be able to see again. And in the introduction to the writings of John Muir, William Frederick Bede wrote that he basically realized that his life was too short to be in the factory. And John Muir himself said, "This affliction has driven me to the sweet fields." And then we all kind of know what happened after that. So it turns out that my own dad went through something similar. And when he was about my age, he got really fed up with his job as a technician in the Bay Area. And he quit and decided that he had enough money to live extremely cheaply for a while, and that ended up being 2 years. I asked him recently what he did during those 2 years, and he said he rode his bike, studied math, went fishing, had long chats with his friend and roommate, and sat in this spot where he taught himself the flute. And he said that after a while, he kind of realized that a lot of the angst that he had about his job had more to do with him than the actual job. The way he put it was, it's just you with yourself and your own crap, so you have to deal with it. And so he actually ended up going back to the old job, which he realized at that point was pretty good, and they just welcomed him back. And he said it was a humbling experience, but that 2 years taught him something about creativity and the state of openness, nothing, and maybe even boredom that it requires, but mostly the amount of time. So it reminds me of John Cleese's factors for creativity, in which 2 and 3 are time. But also knowing that my dad went back not as a technician, well, he went back initially as a technician, but became an engineer and started racking up patents. And so he was not the same the second time around. And my dad has the same penchant for close observation as I do. This is a typical text from my dad. We really enjoy blobs. Yeah. Yeah. So this got me thinking that maybe the granularity of the attention that we achieve outward can also extend inward. So as the perceptual details of your environment unfold in surprising ways, so do your own intricacies and contradictions. My dad said that after that period, he understood himself not in relationship to that world, but just the world in general. So things that happened at work were only one small part of that. It also reminds me that John Muir described himself not as a botanist, but as a poetico-trampo geologist, botanist, and ornithologist, naturalist, et cetera, or Pauline Oliveros' autobiographical statement from 1974. Pauline Oliveros is a two-legged human being, female, lesbian, musician, composer, among other things, which contribute to her identity. And then she mentions her partner and her poultry, dogs, cats, rabbits, hermit crabs. This has inspired me to maybe change my bios to artist, professor, thinker, walker, sleeper, eater, plant smeller, and amateur bird noticer. So there's a really obvious critique of all of this, which is that it's based on a lot of privilege. So I can sit in the rose garden all the time and stare into trees because I have a teaching job that only requires me to be somewhere twice a week. Not to mention a whole set of other privileges. My dad could do what he did because probably on some level he had some reasonable expectation of being able to get another job. So it's possible to understand the practice of doing nothing as a self-indulgent luxury, kind of like the equivalent of taking a mental health day if you're lucky enough to work somewhere that has one of those. But I still come back to Deleuze's right to say nothing and to do nothing, and I believe that this is indeed a right and not a luxury. So one example is the movement for the 8-hour workday in 1886, where they were calling for 8 hours of work, 8 hours for rest, and 8 hours for what we will. What we will is not even defined here. It could be education and it could be leisure, but it's what we will. And what seems most humane to me is the refusal to define what that period is. I'm also struck by the quality of things that are associated with the category of what we will in this song that they wrote. Rest, thought, flowers, sunshine. These are all bodily human things, and that bodiliness is something that I will come back to. But when Samuel Gomper, as the leader of this movement, was asked, what does labor want? He said, labor wants the earth and the fullness thereof. So this movement was really about a demarcation of time. So I find it very troubling to read the decline in labor movements in general alongside kind of an evaporation of public space, which has a very similar function and is kind of the spatial underpinnings for doing nothing. So true public spaces, the most obvious examples being parks and libraries, are, again, what allow the practice of doing what we will. A true public space demands nothing for you in order to enter, nor for you to stay. The most obvious difference between public space and a private space is that you don't have to buy anything or pretend like you want to buy something. So compare, for instance, the open-endedness of a city park with something like City Walk. I don't know if anyone here has ever been to City Walk, but it's kind of this area between Universal Studios and the actual city. And in that way, and many other ways, it sort of exists somewhere in between. It's kind of like the theme park version of an actual city. And it's almost like a movie set, so visitors can come and consume not only products, but also consume a safe and commodified version of a city. In an essay about this, Eric Holding and Sarah Chaplin call it a scripted space that excludes, directs, supervises, constructs, and orchestrates use. And anyone who's tried anything funny, any funny business in a faux public space knows that these actions aren't just scripted, they're policed. So Mike Davis has also written about the kind of the ideas of crowd control in such spaces like this. So in a true public space, you are a free agent, ideally, and in a faux public space, you are either a consumer or a threat to the system. So the Rose Garden is a public space. It's also a works progress administration project from the 30s. And so it was made by people put to work by the federal government during the Depression. And this is something that I really like thinking about when I'm there, that this incredible public good came itself from another public good. But it's still not surprising to me that I found out that this park was almost turned into condos in the 70s, and a bunch of local residents had to kind of band together to stop that from happening. And the reason I'm not surprised is that this kind of thing is always happening. Spaces that are not seen as commercially productive are always under threat, since what they produce can't be measured, exploited, identified in any obvious way, even though anyone who lives around here can tell you what an immense value this garden provides. And currently, I see kind of a similar battle playing out for our time, a colonization of the self by capitalist ideas of productivity and efficiency. You might say that the parks and libraries of the self are always about to be turned into condos. So in this book, After the Future, which is a huge downer, but I recommend it. And then he has another book after that that's even more of a downer, so there's more future after the future. But Franco Berardi has tied the defeat of labor movements in the 80s to this idea that we should all be entrepreneurs. So in the past, economic risk was kind of the business of the capitalist or the investor. But today we are all capitalists, and therefore we all have to take risks. And in this formulation, your life itself is an economic venture. Berardi's descriptions of labor will sound familiar to anyone concerned with their personal brand, any Uber driver, any content moderator, any hard-up freelancer, aspiring YouTube star, or adjunct professor who drives to 3 campuses in 1 week, i.e. your time is always available to connect. And so this removal of economic security for working people, 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what we will, dissolves those boundaries into 24 potentially monetizable hours that are sometimes not even restricted to our time zones or our sleep cycles. And so in this moment when every waking moment has become pertinent to making a living, and we submit even our leisure to numerical evaluation on Facebook and Instagram, constantly checking on its performance like you check a stock, monitoring the ongoing development of our personal brand, time becomes an economic resource that we can no longer justify spending on nothing. It provides no return on investment. It is simply too expensive. And this is kind of a cruel confluence of time and space. So just as we lose non-commercial space, we begin to see all of our own time as potentially commercial. And just as public space gives way to faux public retail spaces or weird corporatized parks, privatized parks, so we are sold the idea of a compromised leisure or a freemium leisure that is a very far cry from what we will. So while I was going through those Byte magazines, I came across a lot of ads about things that were supposed to save you time. And this one's called the Power Lunch, and I just want to point out that he's drinking milk, which I find weird. So compare this ad with this ad, which I'm sure some of you saw in the BART stations. This is an ad for Fiverr. If you don't know what Fiverr is, it's a microtasking site where individual entrepreneurs sell various tasks, so basically units of their time for $5. That could be anything from copy editing to filming a video of themselves doing something of your choice to pretending to be your girlfriend on Facebook. Fiverr is the ultimate expression of Franco Berardi's phrase, fractals of time and pulsating cells of labor. And here, the idea that you would even withhold some of that time to sustain yourself with food is essentially ridiculed. These people work from home, but unlike the man with the sandwich and the milk, they must work from home. Home is work, and work is home. And this is not necessarily limited to the gig economy. For a few years after grad school, I worked in the marketing department of a large corporation where I would amuse myself by taking photo booth photos with this cardboard cutout, my only friend. I eventually had to recycle her. It was very sad. The company had just instituted something called results-only work environment, or ROE. And the idea of ROE is that there's no longer any set time that you have to be in your desk. You can do work at any time at your pace, and as long as you get it done, it's fine. And this sounded nice, but there was something about the name that bothered me, i.e., like, what is the E in ROE? If work environments could be your office, your car, the store, at home, like, when are you not at work? And at the time, surprisingly, I did not have a smartphone yet, and I put off getting one even longer because I could sort of see the writing on the wall, and like the combination of phone and this meant that I would be permanently answerable to somebody 24/7, even if my leash was a lot longer. So we had a required reading, Why Work Sucks and How to Fix It. And I think the authors intended to describe kind of like a merciful slackening of the 9-to-5 model, be in your chair from 9 to 5. But I was troubled by how work and non-work selves were conflated in this text. So they write, if you can have your time and work and live and be a person, then the question you're faced with every day isn't, do I really have to go to work today, but how do I contribute to this thing called life? What can I do today to benefit my family, my company, myself? To me, company doesn't belong in that sentence. Even if you love your job, unless there's something specifically about you or your job that requires it, I don't think that there's anything to be admired about being constantly connected, constantly potentially productive the second you open your eyes in the morning. And in my opinion, no one should accept this, not now, not ever. Yeah, in the words of Othello, leave me but a little to myself. So this constant connection and difficulty of maintaining any kind of silence or interiority was already a problem, but after the election it seemed especially like a crisis to me. So the same means by which we give over our hours and our days are the same with which we assault ourselves with information and misinformation at a rate that is frankly inhumane. I'm not saying don't read the news or what other people have to say about the news, but I think we can all see that there's something unhealthy happening, and also a problem of speed and attention span, which seem to be inversely related and driving each other. So Berardi says that modern regimes are not founded on the repression of dissent and not on the enforcement of silence, but rather on the proliferation of chatter, the irrelevance of opinion and discourse, and on making thought, dissent, and critique banal and ridiculous. And he says the real problem is an immense informational overload and siege of attention combined with the occupation of the sources of information by the head of the company. So it is this financially incentivized proliferation of chatter and the utter speed at which waves of hysteria now happen online that so deeply horrified me and offended my senses as a human who dwells in human bodily time. The connection between something virtual and utterly real, like Pizzagate or the doxing and swatting of online journalists, is deeply and fundamentally disturbing on a human phenomenological level. And I know that after the election, a lot of us were kind of searching for this thing called truth, but I felt like I was just searching for reality and something that I could just point to and say, this is real. So, birds. Something else that happened after the election was that I started to notice some birds in my neighborhood. First, I noticed some night herons that hang out by the KFC in Grand Lake almost all day and all night pretty reliably. And if you've never seen one, they're very kind of grumpy, stoic birds. They have necks like other herons, but they kind of keep them a secret, and they just stay in this football shape. And I soon modified my path home from the bus just to pass them. And anyone who follows me on Twitter knows that like all of my tweets are about night herons. So yeah. And I think what was comforting about them to me was that I could just look up from whatever trash fire was happening on Twitter, and they would still be there day after day, unmoving, in the rain, no matter what. And I actually found them on 2011 Street View. And I have no doubt that they go back further, but Street View doesn't go back any further. So, I also started noticing some crows in my neighborhood, and I had just read The Genius of Birds, and I had learned that crows are really smart. They're some of the smartest birds, and they can recognize human faces. And they can teach their children who the good and bad humans are if you do something weird. So I started putting peanuts on my balcony, which nothing happened for a really long time, and I just felt like a crazy person. And then this went on for a while, and sometimes they'd be gone, but I wouldn't see anything happen. And then finally, the crows decided that they would not land on the balcony, but they would land on the telephone wire nearby. And one started coming around every day about the time that I eat breakfast, and sometimes it would like caw to like make me come out and give it a peanut. And one day, it brought its kid. Which I know is its kid because it had an undeveloped chicken-like squawk at the time. He's like grown up now. But. So I named them Crow and Crowson. And I soon discovered that Crow and Crowson prefer it when I throw peanuts off the balcony so they can do fancy dives to go get them. And I can't read crow minds, but it seems to me like they enjoy doing this, and I really enjoy watching it. Yeah, and sometimes they don't want any peanuts, and they just sit there and stare at me. One time, Crowson followed me halfway down the street, and I spend a lot of time staring back at them, which I feel like probably looks really weird to my neighbors. But again, it was sort of this, I felt comforted similarly to the night herons, and just like their presence, and also this idea that they recognize me, and I don't know what they do the rest of the day, but they stop by my place every day. And by the way, there's now 3, so either that's the other parent or a family friend. I'm not sure. And then this guy. This is a scrub jay that lives in a particular corner of the rose garden. They also recognize humans, and they also really like peanuts. And whenever I go, I have a bench that I always sit at, and I listen for that shriek that I played you earlier, and then if I hear it, usually this guy will show up and want some peanuts. Scrub jays are really smart in part because they can remember up to 200 locations where they buried their snacks. And if they see someone else see them burying it, they will rebury it, which suggests that they have theory of mind, which is pretty exciting. So one of my favorite things to watch is a scrub jay taking a peanut and then hammering it into the ground with its beak and then artfully placing sticks and leaves over it as if nothing happened. And this isn't just about me watching birds. I think a lot about what these birds see when they look at me. And I think that probably what they see is just recurrence, day after day, week after week, and just a female human who's paying attention to them. And through them, I am actually able to inhabit that perspective on myself as the human animal that I am. And when they fly off, to some extent, I can inhabit that perspective too. I've noticed the shape of the hill that I live on and all the tall trees and good landing spots. There are some ravens that live kind of half in and half out of the rose garden, and then I realized that there is no rose garden to them, strictly speaking. And these alien animal perspectives on me and the shared world that we live in have surprisingly provided me with like an escape hatch from contemporary anxiety, but also a reminder of my own animality and the animateness of the world that I live in. Their flights enable my own literal flights of fancy, which recalls a question that one of my favorite authors, David Abram, asks in Becoming Animal. Do we really believe that the human imagination can sustain itself without being startled by other shapes of sentience? And so as strange as this sounds, this explains my need to go to the Rose Garden after the election. What was missing from that surreal and terrifying torrent of information and virtuality is any regard or place for the human animal, situated as she is in an experiential time and physical environment with other human and non-human entities. It turns out that groundedness requires actual groundedness in the ground. So Abram writes that direct, sensuous reality is the sole solid touchstone that we have in this kind of experience that we're living in. And when I realized this, I kind of grabbed onto it like a life raft. This is real. The living, breathing bodies in this room are real. I'm not an avatar, a set of preferences, some smooth cognitive force. I'm lumpy. I'm an animal. I'm different one day to the next. I hear and see and smell things that hear and see and smell me. And for me, it takes a break to remember that, to do nothing and to listen. So I want to be clear that I'm not actually encouraging anyone to do nothing in the larger sense. There's a lot of racial, environmental, and economic injustice to be angry about and acted upon right now. And there's also a lot to be mourned. Ironically, in such situations, I think it's even more important to do nothing because those are the times that we think and sustain and heal ourselves. So I suggest that we reimagine FOMO as NOMO, the necessity of missing out, or if that bothers you, NOSMO, the necessity of sometimes missing out. And so you could, some of that is like a self-care thing, but there's something kind of more important that I think comes out of that, which is, has to do with listening. So I've already talked about deep listening, but it turns out that listening in the bodily sense has a lot to do with listening as in me understanding your perspective. To do nothing is to hold yourself still for long enough to perceive what is actually there in front of you. And I'm certainly not immune to this, but I think a lot of us could learn to listen better. And some of that's our fault and some of it's not. I don't want to write off the amazing culture and activism that happens online, but filter bubble aside, the platforms that we use to talk to each other don't encourage listening. They encourage shouting or having a take after having read a single headline. And so I alluded earlier to speed, but this is also a problem of listening and bodies in particular. So Berardi, to come back to him, he makes this distinction between connectivity and sensitivity. So connectivity is the rapid circulation of information among compatible units. So for me, this would be something like a bunch of shares on Facebook of the same thing by a bunch of very like-minded people. In this case, you either are or are not compatible. And the information, the units in this kind of scheme don't change. Versus sensitivity, which is a difficult, awkward, and ambiguous encounter between two differently shaped bodies that are themselves ambiguous. And this meeting and sensing requires and takes place in time. The information transfer is complex, and because of that, the two entities may come away changed. So connectivity is a share or a trigger. Sensitivity is an in-person conversation, whether pleasant or difficult or a little of both. Obviously, online platforms favor connectivity, not simply by virtue of being online, but arguably for profit, since the difference between connectivity and sensitivity is time, and time is money. Again, too expensive. And so as the body disappears, so does our ability to empathize. Berardi asks us to hypothesize the connection between the loss of nonverbal ways of communicating and our just ability to even sense those at all, to make sense. So in online platforms, anything that can't be verbalized is figured as excess or incompatible, even though every in-person encounter we've ever had teaches us the importance of the nonverbal expressions of the body, not to mention the very matter-of-fact presence of the body in front of you. And then lastly, for me, doing nothing is a critique of the cult of productivity and development. And so in nature, things that grow unchecked are considered parasitic or cancerous, but our culture routinely privileges novelty and growth over the cyclical and the regenerative. Our very idea of what productivity is premised on the idea of producing something new, whereas we do not tend to see maintenance and care as productive in the same way. So I want to just briefly mention some regulars of the rose garden here. This is the casual turkey. There's two, but here's one. And then there's also Grayson the cat, who, if you are reading, will sit on your book. Yeah, so those are some regulars. The main regulars of the garden are volunteers. And they are a reminder that the rose garden is beautiful because it's cared for and that effort must be put in, whether that's for saving it from becoming condos or just making sure the roses come back next year. And this always makes me think of the Maintenance Manifesto by the artist Miralay Laterman-Ukeles, who is known for her performances, for instance, washing the steps of the exhibiting museum, spending 11 months shaking hands with and thanking New York City's 8,500 sanitation men, telling each one of them, thank you for keeping New York City alive. And the Maintenance Manifesto came out of her experience of becoming a mother in the 1960s. So she said, being a mother entails an enormous amount of repetitive tasks. I became a maintenance worker. I felt completely abandoned by my culture because it didn't have a way to incorporate sustaining work. And so the Maintenance Manifesto is actually an exhibition proposal in which she says she will perform all of the duties that she does as a mother, but that her work is the work. And she makes this distinction in the manifesto between the death instinct and the life instinct. The life instinct is concerned with cyclicality, care, and regeneration. The death instinct sounds a lot like disrupt. And of course, both are necessary, but one is routinely valorized, not to mention masculinized, while the other one goes unrecognized because it has no part in progress. That brings me to one last thing I will share with you about the rose garden. I first noticed this as a series of numbers in the tens. And if you go up to them, there's sort of plaques with women's names in them. And it turns out that they're the names of women who were voted Mother of the Year by Oakland residents. And it was added to the garden in 1954. To be Mother of the Year, you have to have contributed to improving the quality of life for the people of Oakland. And this is from an old industry film about Oakland. So I noticed some increased activity in the Rose Garden this past May, and I realized that they were getting ready for Mother of the Year 2017. So here's Mother of the Year from last year. And presumably there are many more Mothers of the Year to come. It goes all the way up to 2050. And here I just want to give a shout out to my own mom, who has volunteered on top of working for much of her adult life and supports parents with foster children. So thanks, Mom. And so yeah, I'm talking about mothers in the context of work that sustains and maintains, but I don't think you need to be a mother to know what that means. Thinking about this always brings me back to a book called Paradise Built in Hell by Rebecca Solnit, in which she examines and dispenses with the myth that people become selfish and desperate after natural disasters. So from the 1906 earthquake to Hurricane Katrina, she interviews people who have this, not nostalgia, but they remember having a feeling of purpose and connection and even humor, often the first time that they met their neighbors. And there's just an incredible amount of just altruism and empathy. And she says that after disaster, people step up, and that horrible in itself, disaster is sometimes a door back into paradise. The paradise, at least, in which we are who we hope to be, do the work we desire, and are each our sisters and brothers' keeper. She suggests that the real disaster is everyday life, which alienates us from each other, and also the purposeful and protective impulse that we harbor. So in a similar sense, what I'm suggesting is that we adopt a protective stance towards ourselves and each other, that we protect our spaces and our time for non-instrumental, non-commercial activity and thought, for maintenance, for care, for conviviality, and that we fiercely protect our human animality against all technologies and rhetorics that actively ignore and disdain the bodies of others, and the body of the land that we physically inhabit. to come back to Abram, he writes that all of our technological utopias and dreams of machine-mediated immortality, basically, they fire our minds, but they cannot feed our bodies. And that actually a lot of that is motivated by just a fear of the body being in a body at all. There are certain people who would like to use technology to live longer or forever. To me, this sounds a lot like an illustration of Euclid's death drive in her maintenance manifesto. And to such men, I would propose that a far more parsimonious way to live forever is to exit the track of productive time so that a single moment might open almost into infinity. But such a solution isn't good for business, nor can it be considered particularly innovative. But in the long meantime, as I sit in the deep bowl of the rose garden, in a reality interwoven with other humans and non-humans, other bodily sensitivities besides my own, and the boundaries of my own body sometimes overcome by the smells of jasmine and blackberries, I sometimes look down at my phone and wonder if it isn't its own kind of sensory deprivation chamber. So you may be wondering what this means for me as an artist, and especially as a digital artist. From this point, I look back and see that I've worked a lot with Google Earth, which is basically spending hours and hours looking at the Earth, albeit from a digital remove. And how one of my most rewarding experiences as an artist was a physical engagement with actual objects of refuse at the dump, picking them up, looking at them, smelling them. And just the hours that I've spent in the rose garden now, putting off work on a glowing two-dimensional screen an arm's length from my face, or all the times that I leave for coffee and end up on a hill 4 hours later, regardless of the shoes I'm wearing, or the fact that the last 4 or 5 books I've read have all been about animal intelligence and landscape. I don't know where any of this or where I am going to end up. So as a thank you gift for listening to me talk about nothing, only to have me tell you that I don't know what I'm doing, I want to give you a little bit of nothing. A few years ago, before I started thinking about this in any sort of concentrated way, I was coming home from Stanford on Caltrain, and anyone who's been on Caltrain knows that it's also full of other stressed out people, all working, and I myself was feeling very confined and thinking about a million things that I needed to do, and just very rigid and isolated. And at this moment, my boyfriend happened to send me a podcast about Gordon Hempton, who is the acoustic ecologist I quoted earlier. And in the middle of this podcast, there is a part where he plays a recording that he made of thunder. Hearing this in the midst of everything that was going on gave me this feeling that is honestly impossible to verbalize, so I won't. I will just ask all of you to close your eyes. Thank you.